Time once again for an edition of Ghost Story here on Frozen Frights. Ghost Story being, of course, a side podcast, kind of a side project that I produced back in 2015. These are all original stories. We think they lend a certain creepiness to the feed. If you have any questions or comments, email address, as always, iceboxradio51@gmail.com. And now the second in a series of original ghost stories, Gold Nugget. Wind whispers through the trees. Bats whisper through the eaves. Your mind's whispers are full of fear, and I whisper in your ear. I am called the Whispering Man, and you're listening to Ghost Story. This is a story, a road trip story. It's about a young woman, 22 or 23 years old, driving from Minnesota to California for college. Her name was Carrie, and she was on her own. It was just her and her dad back in Minnesota, her mom having died when she was very little. Her dad worried about her, but he'd given her a good car and made sure she'd had some self-defense classes and could handle herself. So he was fairly confident she could arrive safely, and she was too. Carrie was always very confident. But it was a lonely ride to California. From the prairies to the desert, pretty much all the way to the mountain range right before Los Angeles, there wasn't a lot of company. One year along the way, Carrie saw a hitchhiker. It was a young woman, right about her age, standing out in the heat of the desert. This was in that old seabed territory in Utah where everything looked as if it was from the end of the world, a Martian landscape. And here, out in the heat, was this girl, 22 years old, not very well dressed. She had on tiny jean shorts, a halter top along with a cowboy hat and boots, and a pair of mirrored sunglasses. Carrie thought she should really pull over and pick up the girl because she was going to be picked up sooner or later dressed like that, and not necessarily by someone who means her well. The girl was overjoyed that another single woman had picked her up. They drove for a while and talked and learned a little bit about each other. The woman said her name was Rita and she was from New York City originally, but had been all over the place. Her story kept changing slightly, Carrie noticed. First, she was headed to California to see her mother. Then there was talk of an aunt in Oregon that she was going to see. Carrie was aware of this shifting story and felt a little embarrassed for Rita. She talked of being in Broadway shows and movies and of modeling in Paris. Carrie just smiled, the way you'd smile at a little child telling stories. "You know there's a lot of gold up here, right?" Rita said out of the blue. Carrie just smiled. She doubted there was much gold left up in these mountains, and she doubted someone like Rita, dressed as she was as an 80s rock video dancer, knew much about prospecting. "Seriously," Rita persisted, "there's tons. Look what I pulled out of the ground just today." Rita reached back to her pack and fiddled with some zippers. In a moment, she brought out a small rock about the size of a golf ball. It was mostly gray, but with some flakes of dim gold in it. Carrie took her eyes off the road just long enough for a closer look. She didn't know much about geology, but she had the idea that this might actually be a small sample of the real thing. Gold. "It's locked in quartz," Rita said, "but there's plenty of gold in there. Just have to refine it out." Carrie glanced up and saw Rita's eyes fixed on hers, holding her in a steady gaze. There was something unnaturally still about Rita's eyes, like they were a doll's eyes made of glass, and Carrie felt a chill despite the desert heat. "Trade you a Coke," Rita said suddenly. "What?" "I'll trade you the Nugget for a Coke." "I don't have any Coke." Rita laughed at that. Up there, silly. Pull over. Carrie noticed for the first time that a little gas station had appeared on the horizon. An old, weathered shack with a pop machine out front and 2 gas pumps. Before Carrie really knew what she was doing, she pulled off the highway and up to the pumps. She got out, topped off her tank. It's always a good idea to get gas where you can in the desert. And was getting back behind the wheel when Rita said, "What about our trade?" She was leaning forward, holding the small rock out to Carrie with a look of childlike longing on her face. With a tilt of her head, she indicated the pop machine. "Please," Rita said, biting her lip. "I don't have any cash on me and I'm dying here. I need a drink." Carrie sighed and took the rock, slipping it into her pocket as she got out and headed to the soda machine. Carrie returned to the car, gave Rita her soda without comment. Rita popped the top and started drinking, being unusually silent as she did. Carrie pulled back onto the highway. They drove in silence for a minute or 2. Then suddenly a man popped up in the back seat and Carrie screamed. "It's all right," Rita said, laughing. Carrie steadied the wheel while looking at the man through the rear view. He was about their age, shirtless, no bag or backpack or anything, and he was good-looking, but Carrie scarcely noticed. Rita was nonchalant. "Oh, this is Brad," she said. "I met him back at the gas station. He needs a ride." "Hey," the man said with a country drawl. So Carrie weighed her options. She could pull over right away and kick them both out. She could pull over and kick Brad out, though Brad didn't look like he was planning to take a long trip that day, and kicking him out in the desert might lead to his early demise. Or Carrie thought she could bide her time. They had over a day left before getting to Los Angeles. They were going to have to stop and rest. And Brad, well, to be honest, Brad looked like a big, goofy kid who'd been hanging around the gas station and just thought he'd ask for a ride. So Carrie decided to bide her time. A few hours went by. They got to know each other a little better. Brad, like Rita, had a story that kept changing. He was headed to Los Angeles because he had a job. He was going to see an uncle in Nebraska, which was, of course, the opposite direction. He said all kinds of things. None of it really made sense. Carrie got to the point where she wasn't saying anything anymore. She just gripped the wheel and listened. Pretty soon, Carrie began to hear similarities between the two of them. Rita and Brad seemed to be talking the same language, and she kept glancing at them from the corner of her eye and wondering if maybe they were related. The resemblance was striking. And then, out of the middle of a stretch of nothing, no cars around, Rita suddenly took off the cowboy hat and sunglasses she'd been wearing and shook out her hair. She had a very close-cropped hairstyle, almost a crew cut. And then she looked right at Carrie, and Carrie took her eyes from the road and looked right back. And Brad leaned in from the back seat and put his face right next to Rita's. And it was then that Carrie saw it. They wanted her to see it. They were twins. Brad just looked at Carrie and laughed, and then he leaned back and stared out the window. Carrie drove on. Nobody said anything for a half hour or more, until Rita, without any preamble, said, "Hey, Brad, tell that story about old Douglas." Carrie didn't know what she was talking about, of course, but Brad did. Brad started right in. "Oh, the one about old Douglas," he said. "Yeah, he was a prospector around these parts way back in the gold rush days, 1800s. They called him Old Douglas because he was a little different than your average prospector. He was a college professor from Boston, got the gold bug and came out west. He was just one of the many prospectors who claimed to have found the lost Dutchman's mine. These guys would go out into the desert and go crazy with heat. They'd claim to find caves lined with the purest ore you've ever seen. Millions of dollars just sitting out there, waiting for someone to pick it up. But As the story goes, they'd always get sidetracked by a storm or something and could never find their way back to the claim. The Old Douglas claim was one that people talked about a lot on account of Old Douglas being an educated man. Everyone figured he wouldn't be quite so inclined to flights of fancy as some of the other prospectors, so a lot of people have gone looking for Old Douglas's claim. After a while, serious prospectors gave up, but the kids didn't. The kids in this region went out looking for it all the time, even up into modern times. Sometimes on dirt bikes and dune buggies, sometimes just on foot, walking off the road into the desert, walking off the road looking for the first telltale signs that was supposed to lead to a series of clues, taking it up to a mountain pass where the claim was supposed to be. Then Brad said, "Rita, why don't you tell the rest?" By this time, Carrie's heart was beating fast. She was frightened but didn't know why. She didn't really know who these people were. She didn't know what they wanted from her. But she did know they were on a stretch of highway where they hadn't seen another car in over 10 minutes. "Oh, the rest of the story," Rita said. "That's about these kids, 4 of them. This happened not too long ago. These kids went up into the hills one July weekend on a whim. They went looking for Old Douglas's claim. 2 of them got out. The other 2 didn't. The other 2 walked off into the desert and disappeared forever." Carrie could feel both of them watching her. "Those 2 were twins," Rita said. "Twins from right around here. They were popular. They were both going to go to college. One was going to study law, the other architecture. But none of that happened. You know the worst part, though? The worst part is that they couldn't even have a proper funeral because their bodies were never found. Their bones are still up in the desert there someplace, waiting for somebody to carry them out. Their bones have surely been picked dry by now." "Dry as dust," Brad said, and his voice was different. It was low, threatening, a touch of menace in it that hadn't been there before. About that time, Carrie saw another gas station. She'd been so engrossed in the story that she hadn't noticed it until they were practically upon it. She slammed on the brakes, cranked the wheel, and slid off the road into the gravel parking lot. "I need to go to the bathroom," she stammered, putting the car in park and ripping the keys from the ignition. She unbuckled her seatbelt, and as she opened the door, she practically fell out onto the hot gravel. Had she felt Brad's hand on her shoulder as she opened the door? Had she seen Rita make a last-second lunge as she tumbled out? She couldn't be sure. She just walked away as fast as she dared. Carrie went into the gas station, which was not a chain, but a beat-up independent, with filthy baseball caps on the ceiling and fishing gear on the walls, even though there didn't seem to be any water anywhere in the whole county. There was an old man behind the counter. She asked to use the restroom, and he pointed to it. She closed the door quietly and just leaned against the sink for 10 minutes. She washed her face as best she could, but the water was warm, almost too warm to bear. Finally, after her heartbeat had slowed, Carrie came out into the store and grabbed a water from the cooler, thinking she should buy something if she used the restroom. She came up to the counter and set the bottle down, reached for her wallet, and then, as she went to give the old man the money, she happened to notice a flyer tacked on the wooden post right next to the cash register. It was a "Have you seen me?" poster. On it was a picture of 2 teenagers, and it said their names were Rita and Brad. The flyer looked old and weathered. Carrie felt her blood turn to ice. She pointed to the flyer. "I remember hearing about those 2, she lied. "Did they ever find them?" "Nope, never did," the old man said. "Course, some people say they still see 'em along the road sometimes. It all depends on how sensitive you are to that kind of thing." The old man was looking at Carrie now, squinting at her, sizing her up. She felt naked under his gaze. "They say," he continued, "they're always along the road looking for people to come up into the desert with them. They say if you go with them, you'll never come back." And then the man leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Have you seen anything strange along the road, miss?" Carrie ran through her options. Should she tell the old man? Ask him to come out to her car? Should we call the police? And then just like that, it was like a great weight was lifted from her shoulders. And she went out through the doors, out into the parking lot, without another word. She could hear the door chime beeping because she had forgot to close the door behind her when she tumbled out. And there in the back seat, and in the passenger seat were nobody. Nobody at all. Carrie stared at her car a long time. The wind blew the dust around the gas pumps. The door chime of her car continued to beep incessantly. Eventually, her practical nature took over, and she got back into the car and closed the door to keep the chime from running down the battery. And as she sat in the driver's seat, she felt something poke her hip from her pocket, and she remembered the gold nugget. Carrie reached into her pocket and pulled out something that felt like a small rock, and when she held it up into the light, she could clearly see what it was. It was bone. A small piece of dried human bone.